Chapter 3 of our text deals with nutrition and with the transport of these nutrients and other particles across the cells of your body. And so this lecture will be divided into two different parts. The first part, this particular lecture that you're listening to now, will deal with nutrients and the utilization of those nutrients by your body. The second half of the lecture will deal with the transport of these nutrients across cells. And so it'll be in the first part of our lecture that we see the significance of these pictures that we have on the very first slide of our lecture. We'll see that the pirate, shown on the left, would not have had the dental problems that he has if he had access to the fruits that we see on the right on this first slide of our lecture. Alright, let's begin our discussion of nutrients. And so we first want to mention that nutrients are divided into two categories based on how many of them or how much of an individual nutrient your body requires. Nutrients are either considered macronutrients or micronutrients depending on the degree to which your body needs to utilize them. All these nutrients are substances that are found in foods that provide one of two things or possibly both of these things simultaneously. And so everything that you eat is either providing you with energy or with the actual structural materials that are required to build the different portions of your body. And so we'll talk about how these individual nutrients are utilized as we move forward. Macronutrients are nutrients that are required in large amounts. Most of the nutrients that we talk about over the next couple slides will be macronutrients, and you'll recall in Chapter 2 that many of these nutrients were discussed as we discussed the biological molecules. You, of course, are a living organism, and the components that build your cells are the same components that we see in all other living things. Now, in different quantities, admittedly, depending on if you're a plant or animal or fungi or bacteria, but still, we have the same basic biological molecules that compose all living things. The very first macronutrient that we want to discuss is water. Water is something that's needed in fairly large quantities by the human body. Adults need about 3 liters per day, and too little water, as you know, leads to a condition referred to as dehydration. And so the question we should ask is, what is our body using that water to accomplish? And first, there are a number of different processes that require water, the first of which that we'll mention is the circulatory system. And so the circulatory system, as you realize, is a system that utilizes a substance we refer to as blood that's composed of a couple other substances that we'll talk about later in our class. And the purpose of the circulatory system is to transport products from one part of the body to another. And so you realize that one of the most important products that's transported would be oxygen. And so oxygen is continually transported from your lungs to all the cells of your body. Every single cell that's alive in your body has to have this continuous supply of oxygen in order to survive. The carbon dioxide that's produced by those cells is transported back to the lungs and then exported by the respiratory system from the body. You also realize that, more relevant to this chapter, nutrients are being transported by the circulatory system. The whole purpose of eating is to take in food particles, which are ground into tiny, tiny pieces. Those small molecules are taken up into your bloodstream and then transported to various cells in your body, in which they are actually turned into energy in a process that we'll talk about in the next chapter, in Chapter 4. So the circulatory system is certainly an important system in your body that requires a great deal of water. Interestingly, your excretory system, as you would have guessed, also requires a certain amount of water. You have what's called a minimum excretory volume. In other words, you have to excrete a certain amount of water each day to get rid of the waste that you must excrete from your body. Interestingly, the minimum excretory volume varies from one organism to another. You have the ability to concentrate your urine down to a certain point, but no further than that, based on the characteristics of your kidneys. If you happen to be a kangaroo rat, a little animal that's found in the desert, you would see that you would have the ability to concentrate your urine down to a point where it's so concentrated that it's basically little wet crystals that are being excreted, which is advantageous if you live in a desert because it allows you to get by with less water. But humans don't have that ability to concentrate their urine that far, so we have this minimum excretory volume, a certain amount of water we have to release each day in order to get rid of the waste that we must release. Otherwise, we start to experience adverse consequences from not being able to get rid of that waste. And water is also used for cooling. And so you realize that when you're hot, you sweat. And so we lose a reasonable amount of water through that process, and water is also utilized to maintain a constant body temperature. Alright, we want to move on to our next macronutrient, and our next one is, or are, carbohydrates. And so carbohydrates will be familiar to you from our previous discussion in Chapter 2. And carbohydrates are the primary energy source in cells. Now we're going to talk more in Chapter 4 about exactly how carbohydrates are turned into energy. But for now, we want to review the fact that we have different types of carbohydrates. We have simple sugars, such as glucose, which can enter our digestive system, enter our circulatory system from our digestive system very quickly. And then we have complex carbohydrates. And so complex carbohydrates are, as you recall from Chapter 2, long chains of glucose molecules that are bound to one another. And so if we look at the bottom of our slide, I can point with the pointer here, with the cursor rather. If we start at the left-hand portion of our diagram, we see fructose. And so fructose is another simple sugar. Glucose is not the only simple sugar, but fructose and glucose are examples of monosaccharides. Simple sugars, the simplest form of a carbohydrate, as we discussed in Chapter 2. You'll recall that these simple sugars are put together into complex sugars or complex carbohydrates as we move to Part B here. And in Part B, we see starch. Starch is a complex carbohydrate that's composed of long chains of glucose molecules that are put together in a branching form. And so you can see the branches here in the spiral conformation of these monosaccharides. If we go over to Part C of our diagram, we see glycogen. And so glycogen is another complex carbohydrate. Interestingly, glycogen is a complex carbohydrate that you have in your liver and muscle cells. Glycogen is a relatively short-term source of energy that your body utilizes. And so when you eat, you take those glucose molecules, they're taken up into your cells and put together to form the glycogen, this complex carbohydrate. And then when you fast, when you don't eat for a relatively short period of time, maybe 6 to 8 hours, then your body starts to break down this glycogen and release those individual glucose molecules into the bloodstream, and you utilize those for energy. So that's what we want to say then regarding these particular complex carbohydrates. Carbohydrates come in different forms. Fiber is a name that's given to complex carbohydrates such as cellulose, which are not digestible by the human body. It's interesting. I think it'll be interesting to you if we look back at this particular slide. We see side by side, as I'm pointing to here, in Part B we see starch, and in Part C of the diagram we see glycogen. And so you are able to digest both of these complex carbohydrates, but the complex carbohydrate starch that we discuss, cellulose that we discuss here, is a carbohydrate that you are not able to digest. It is another complex carbohydrate. It's composed of glucose molecules. It is very similar in its composition to starch, but those glucose molecules are put together in a different way that prevents them from being separated by the enzymes of your body. And so when cellulose then, as you likely remember, is a structural component of plants. And so the green leafy portions of plants and the hard woody parts of plants have a high concentration of cellulose. And so this means then when you eat something like salad or rice, you're taking in large concentrations of cellulose, and you don't use that for energy. You're not able to break apart those glucose molecules and release those into the bloodstream. But it does play a very important role in your overall digestive health. And so interestingly, fiber, also known as cellulose, is very important for the functioning of your large intestine. And it also, this is evident by the fact that when we look at disorders of the intestine, such as colon cancer, which is a very dangerous type of cancer, we see that people who eat large amounts of cellulose have much lower incidence of colon cancer. There's a kind of a natural study that we can look at in the world today. If we look at Asian cultures, which eat to a large extent a rice-based diet, they eat large amounts of rice with most of their meals. They have a very low incidence of colon cancer, much lower than we see in North America, where we tend to have less fiber in our diet and tend to eat a diet that has more fat in it. And so, interestingly, fiber, which is cellulose in almost every case, and cellulose, again, is this large complex carbohydrate that we cannot digest. Fiber plays a very important role in your overall health, even though it's not a molecule that you can actually digest. We next want to talk about proteins as a macronutrient. Now, we talked about proteins last chapter, in chapter 2, and so you're familiar with the fact that proteins are composed of amino acids, and typically a protein will consist of at least hundreds and probably thousands of amino acids. Now, the interesting thing regarding proteins is this, that you need those amino acids that are found in proteins to make the proteins of your body. So what I'm saying is this, that you need to eat, say, a hamburger, because a cow has proteins that are found in the muscle of that cow, which is what you're eating when you eat the hamburger. You take those proteins, you chop those proteins up inside your digestive system into individual amino acids, and then your body reassembles those into proteins that are going to be part of your body. And so your book says that, makes a statement in this chapter, that you are what you eat, and to a large extent that's true. You consist of the amino acids of cows and fish and lobster and whatever it is that you ate. Your body takes those proteins, breaks those down into individual amino acids, and reassembles those to make the proteins of your body. Now, we want to make the point right at this particular junction as well. I want you to think about the production of proteins in your body in the appropriate way. And so this is not something that happens very slowly or every now and then, but the production of proteins in your body happens at this incredible rate. And so if you think about the production of just one type of cell, think about the production of red blood cells. Just imagine these statistics for just a moment. So inside a single red blood cell, you have over 1 million hemoglobin proteins. And each of those hemoglobin proteins contains over 400 amino acids. And so you have this huge number of proteins, over 1 million, found in every single red blood cell. And then think about how many red blood cells you are producing. And you produce over 2 million red blood cells per second, if you can believe that. 2 million every single second. And every one of those 2 million red blood cells you produce has over 1 million proteins found inside it. So the take-home message is your body has this incredible need for proteins. You need to take in a tremendous amount of protein so that your body can chop up those proteins into amino acids and continue the processes the process of protein production for the proteins that will allow you to actually survive. So your body is making, remember, that's just one type of cell. You have all sorts of cells that are made in the body and all sorts of proteins that are associated with those cells. So you have this huge need for protein production, and therefore a huge need for amino acids and need to take in proteins in your diet. When we talk about amino acids, we talk about essential and non-essential amino acids. Essential amino acids are amino acids that the human body cannot make. Regardless of conditions, there's just no way that the cells of a human body can synthesize these amino acids that fall into this essential amino acid category. So interestingly, as you would guess then, the non-essential amino acids are ones that the human body can actually make. There are 20 amino acids that are found in living things. We can synthesize 11 of these, and so 11 of these are non-essential amino acids. 9 are ones that the human body cannot synthesize, and these are known as essential amino acids. And so essential amino acids are found in these proteins referred to as complete proteins. Complete proteins are proteins that contain all of the essential amino acids that we need to survive. A protein can be complete without containing non-essential amino acids, and that would be okay nutrition-wise for humans, because we can, if we're not taking in the non-essential amino acids through our diet, we can actually synthesize those. So interestingly, when we look at animal and plant proteins, then we see that the scenario is not exactly the same concerning essential and non-essential amino acids. Animal proteins are more likely to be complete. In other words, they're more likely to contain all those amino acids that are essential, the ones that we cannot synthesize, and therefore we have to take in via our diet. Plant proteins are less likely to be complete. They're more likely to be have gaps, some absences in amino acids that we have to take in via our diet. And so the overall message that we can take away from this is that if an individual chooses to be a vegetarian, there's certainly nothing wrong with that, but it is something that you have to be more careful about diet-wise. So would be very easy as a vegetarian to not take in all of the essential amino acids that you need to survive. And it can be done, it's just that it requires a little bit more work and a little bit more research and care and attention to what you're eating, as opposed to just eating a diet that contains meat, because that meat is more likely to contain all of those essential amino acids. We can see in the diagram at the bottom of our slide that different types of plants have different types of protein found in them. Lentils are high in lysine and low in valine. Actually, what we're referring to here are the individual amino acids that compose the proteins found in these plants. So lentils have lots of lysine, one amino acid, not much valine, another amino acid, both of which are essential. But rice, on the other hand, is low in lysine and high in valine. And so it is okay to just eat plants, but you have to be careful that you're taking in all of those essential amino acids. Alright, we want to now talk about our next macronutrient, which are fats. And so fats are needed in the diet, and fats are utilized in many different aspects of the body. So remember, we talked previously about phospholipids. Phospholipids make up the majority of all of the plasma membranes in the body. And so fats need to be taken in order to, among other things, synthesize those phospholipids. Fats are also a source of energy that, along with carbohydrates, are a source of energy. So when we look at fats, then, we want to talk briefly about the different types of fats and what types of fats are more healthy and less healthy. First type of fat we want to mention is a saturated fat. Saturated fats consist of fatty acid tails bound to a glycerol head. And so, as we see at the bottom of our screen here, and as I'm pointing to, these are the fatty acid tails. We have 1, 2, 3 fatty acid tails bound to this glycerol molecule. This is referred to as a triglyceride, and this is a fat molecule. So interestingly, in a saturated fat, what we see is this, that the tails, the fatty acid tails, are fairly straight. Now, yes, you may say, well, they go up, down, as I'm pointing to there. That is true, but overall they're fairly straight. There are no 90-degree angles in those tails, and this is because there are no double bonds that are present. The term saturated means, as you can see in this little inset that we see here that I'm pointing to, that every time there's a space for a hydrogen atom is present on this fatty acid tail. There's as many hydrogen atoms present as there possibly can be. So as a result of this, these molecules are fairly straight. As I mentioned previously, there are no kinks or twists in these tails. This means that they can get very close to one another, and they can stack up, kind of like you would stack up sticks, one on top of the other. And as they as they get close to one another, as they do at room temperature, they turn into a solid. So interestingly, saturated fats are typically solid at room temperature. Also, it's interesting to note that most animal fats are saturated fats. Bacon grease, for an example. So you've most likely at some point in your life fried bacon, which is delicious. You've taken that bacon grease, you've dumped it into a jar, and what happens to that bacon grease after you leave it sitting for, I don't know, 10, 20 minutes? And of course the answer is it solidifies. And so that's because it's a saturated fat, it doesn't have any double bonds, and it can therefore solidify at room temperature. Alright, in contrast to this, we have unsaturated fats. And so unsaturated fats do not have as many hydrogens present as could possibly fit on that fatty acid tail. And so if we look down here at our fatty acid tails here, we see the double bond present in that fatty acid tail. And as we zoom in there, we see that the double bond is present, and you'll remember this from our Chapter 2 discussion of bonding. You ask yourself the question, how many partners can carbon form a bond with? And of course, if you think back through the electrons, which you should do as you prepare for this exam that you'll be taking later in the week, then you will remember that carbon has an atomic number of 6, which means that it has 6 protons and therefore 6 electrons. It has 2 in the first shell, 4 in the second shell, and that means it needs how many more on that second shell for that shell to be full? And you'll instantly say it needs 4 more because it needs 8 on that second shell in order for that shell to be full. And that means, of course, since it needs 4 more electrons, that it can form bonds with a maximum of 4 different partners. And so that is what is, sorry about that, that is what's happening here as I point to this carbon. So here we have carbon, and here is 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds that's formed from that carbon. Now, you may say, well, you said just a moment ago that it could form bonds with 4 partners, and I did say that. And typically that's what happens. And so if we look over at this carbon, it is forming bonds with 4 partners. It's bound to a carbon there, a hydrogen there, a carbon there, and a hydrogen there. That's 4. But here, this is a double bond. And so the carbon here is forming 4 bonds, 1, 2, 3, and 4. But 2 of the bonds are with this carbon that is adjacent to it. And so that double bond, the presence of the double bond, means 2 things. One is that there's fewer hydrogens there than could actually be present, and secondly, it means that this fatty acid tail, if we look over here, is going to have a kink in it, a very distinct bend. And so this means that these fats cannot get as close to one another as could the saturated fats, and they're typically liquid at room temperature as a result of that. Most plant fats are typically unsaturated, and they're typically liquid at room temperature. If you think about vegetable oil or corn oil, then both of those things are fats that are liquid at room temperature, and they both come from plants. We've now talked about the difference between saturated and unsaturated fats, and we want to spend just a moment of time talking about what are trans fats. Trans fats are artificially produced saturated fats, and so trans fats are produced in order to take a unsaturated fat and turn it into a product that's both more palatable, it looks more pleasing both to the eye and when you taste it, and also to make something that has a longer shelf life. And so it's very commonly done to make things like margarine, and it's fairly common in the fast food industry today. And so how do you do it? Well, you take an unsaturated fatty acid such as vegetable oil, as is shown in our diagram. And in vegetable oil, you have unsaturated fatty acids that are in what we call the cis configuration. And so if you look on the diagram on the slide, you'll see that cis configuration. The cis configuration results in a bent molecule. When you add hydrogen to that in an artificial situation that involves high pressure, then you incompletely hydrogenate that unsaturated fat, and you turn it into not a saturated fat, but an unsaturated fat that has a different conformation. And so it turns into this trans conformation that we see also in our diagram on this slide. And so you'll notice that the trans conformation looks much like the saturated fat. It's perfectly straight. And so, interestingly, this is not something that's desirable for human health. And so this is not a nutrient that is needed or is even beneficial for the human body. Trans fats have been linked to an increased risk of heart disease and diabetes. And so that's why you hear constantly about how trans fats are bad for you and how trans fats should be avoided. And many companies advertise their food by saying we're low in trans fats. We want to finish up our discussion of nutrients by talking about micronutrients. Everything we've talked about up to this point has been a macronutrient needed in very large quantities. Now we want to talk about micronutrients. Micronutrients are things that your body needs in tiny, 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 tiny quantities. And so a good example of a micronutrient is a vitamin. A vitamin is something that you need in very small quantities in order to be healthy. But if you don't have that vitamin, even though you don't need much of it, if you don't have it, it leads to very serious health consequences. And so vitamins usually function as coenzymes, and we'll see what a coenzyme is here on the next slide. But they have to be present in order for an enzyme to carry out its function in the body. Vitamin D is the only vitamin that we can actually synthesize. All the other vitamins must come from our food, and so that's why you buy vitamins, and that's why vitamins are advertised and recommended that you buy them and consume them. Just a tiny little tablet that has a number of different atoms or elements or perhaps molecules in it, but you need them in such small quantities that one little tablet once a day can provide everything that you need. Some vitamins are water soluble and other vitamins are fat soluble. So what do we mean by a coenzyme, also known as a cofactor? And so this is what we mean. Here, I realize we haven't talked about enzymes yet, and that's something we'll talk about at the beginning of the next chapter. So this is a good warm-up for our discussion of enzymes. But if we look at our screen, then the green molecule, the green blob-like thing you might say on the screen that I'm pointing to here is an enzyme. This is an enzyme that makes collagen. Alright, sorry about that. This is an enzyme that makes collagen. And collagen is a long protein that's present in many parts of your body. It holds many parts of your body together. It's found in your skin, it's found in your gums, it's found in your eyes. Collagen it's found in your bones, and in many parts of your body, almost all parts of your body, in fact, have some of this collagen protein found in it. And so what we see on the screen is that this is the enzyme that makes collagen. If we go from here over to here, then we see this orange molecule is the precursor to collagen. It's the protein that this enzyme uses to make collagen. Here is vitamin C, and so you realize that vitamin C is important. It's found in citrus fruit. Vitamin C has to come along and bind to this part of the enzyme. This is known as the active site of the enzyme. The active site of the enzyme allows the enzyme to function. It allows the enzyme to do its job, as we'll see in the beginning of the next chapter. And so here we see this precursor to collagen coming along and binding to this active site and then leaving as a complete collagen molecule that's going to go and become part of some portion of the body. Here it's becoming part of the bone tissue in your body. So, in other words, this whole process has to occur in order for collagen to be produced. And so, interestingly, most of the actual materials here are the enzyme and then the substrate, the precursor to collagen, which is made into collagen, right? And this little vitamin C cofactor, it can be reused over and over again, and it doesn't take up much space at all. It's fairly small, but this enzyme has to be present. Vitamin C, this cofactor, which is vitamin C, has to be present in order for this enzyme to function. If everything is present except for vitamin C, then none of this occurs. And so what happens when none of this occurs? Well, interestingly, this is what happens when none of this occurs. A disorder that we refer to as scurvy. Scurvy is a disorder that was very common in sailors 150 to 200 years ago. When sailors would go out into the ocean, they would have a diet that consisted primarily of bread, water, and salted meat. and they didn't have a lot of variety. And so when they were out in the ocean for months and months at a time, they didn't get any vitamin C. There was no fruits or vegetables for them to consume, and so the process that we just described could not occur. They didn't have vitamin C, and so they couldn't produce collagen. And as a result of that, there was no collagen that was being incorporated into their skin, into their gums, into their bones. And so their skin started to deteriorate. You can see the pale skin pointed out here. Most distinctly, though, this is what scurvy is known for. Teeth start to fall out. And so the lack of collagen in the gums and in the ligaments that are anchoring the teeth to the skull deteriorate, and you lose teeth. The gums bleed and you lose teeth as a result of scurvy. And so the way that they fixed this is interesting. It was a relatively simple solution. A doctor in the Navy looked at this situation, and he guessed that this might be a vitamin deficiency. That vitamins, we really did not know what vitamins were at that particular point, but he guessed that it might be some dietary deficiency. And so he got big barrels of limes and had big barrels of limes taken aboard the ships. And as long as the sailors would consume just one lime every so often, not many at all, then scurvy was gone completely, because the limes, of course, contain vitamin C. Once vitamin C is present, collagen can be made, and the body functions normally. And so sailors were known as limeys for a period of time as a result of the fact that limes were taken on ships, and they consumed those limes in order to avoid getting scurvy. So remember, that's just one example of a vitamin. That's vitamin C. And you would get scurvy too if you did not consume vitamin C, which would be more difficult to you living unless you're just going to restrict yourself to bread and salted meat and water for long periods of time. It would be harder for you to avoid vitamin C. But that's just one example of a vitamin. There are lots and lots of different vitamins that you have to have in very low quantities in order for your body to function successfully. The very last nutrient we want to talk about is an antioxidant. And so antioxidants are an interesting concept. And to discuss antioxidants, we have to describe free radicals. Free radicals are molecules that are produced by normal processes in the cell. So as your body is digesting and building proteins and carrying out all sorts of processes in the cell, there are byproducts that are produced. And some of these byproducts, although there are not many produced, but some of them are fairly dangerous to other parts of your body, and we call these free radicals. So free radicals are molecules that have an incomplete electron in a set of electrons in their outer shells. So they want to have 8 electrons in that outer shell, and maybe they have 6. So that means they need 2 more. And they go out and they take electrons from other molecules, and they don't care where they get those. They could take them from DNA, they could take them from proteins, or they could take them from lipids that are found in the cell membrane. But they steal electrons from other molecules in the cell to fill that outer shell. And so that causes damage when that occurs. And interestingly, the whole aging process is very closely tied to this, the story of free radicals and what I just described. Why do wrinkles develop? Wrinkles develop primarily because free radicals are extracting electrons from collagen, the protein we just described in our discussion of vitamins. And so when these electrons are taken from collagen, collagen is damaged, and eventually that results in the formation of wrinkles in the skin as a result of long-term damage to collagen. And so that's why you hear antioxidants mentioned very frequently in the health and beauty industry. The prevention of the action of free radicals prevents wrinkles, and that's, I guess, a major component of the beauty industry. So antioxidants then slow or stop these free radicals. Antioxidants are found in fruits and vegetables, grains, and some meat. You hear many advertisements today for supplements that contain antioxidants, and so these may or may not work. That it's yet, your book points out that it's been yet to be demonstrated that these have any beneficial effect beyond the free radicals, or rather the antioxidants that you get from fruits and vegetables. And you absolutely do need those, and that's a good reason to consume fruits and vegetables. The supplements shouldn't hurt, but it's yet to be demonstrated that they are actually giving you more free antioxidants than you would just get through a fruit and vegetable diet. So this concludes the very first portion, the first half of this particular lecture, and we'll have the second half of the lecture in the next video to go with the second half of the notes.